Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we ask, should Russian assets abroad be seized to support Ukraine? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Ukraine's fight against the Russian invasion is costing something in the region of $50 billion a year. Estimates suggest that post-war reconstruction, when it comes, will cost at least $500 billion. Much of this expense is being shouldered by Western nations. The EU committed €50 billion back in February, and in recent weeks the US Congress agreed to support a package amounting to $61 billion. But the willingness of Western governments and publics to continue financing Ukraine is uncertain. Much may hang on the result of the American presidential election in November. So some suggest an alternative way of relieving that burden. Russia holds assets worth some $300 billion in Western countries. Those assets have been frozen since the early days of the war, but why not seize them permanently and hand the money over, either to finance Ukraine's war effort or to pay for reconstruction? Well, one of the people involved in these debates is Dr. Veronika Fikfak, Associate Professor in International Law in the UCL Department of Political Science, expert in the European Court of Human Rights and many, many other things, and also a great friend of the podcast. And I'm delighted that Veronika joins me now. Veronika, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's great to have you on again to explore these really important issues. And shall we start with some of the basics, just to get ourselves going in this debate? What Russian assets are we actually talking about here?
So we're mostly talking about Russian central bank assets. And these assets are actually, the majority of them are in Belgium, in a fund or a clearinghouse called Euroclear. There's around 200 billion of them that are frozen and immobilized. So that means they're not only in one place, but they can't be taken anywhere else. So Russian authorities can't have access to them. But in addition to that, central bank assets, which I think are the sort of the majority of the funds we're talking about, there's also the oligarch funds that have been frozen, and that's around the world. Mm-hmm. So not only the yachts, but, Abramovich had to sell Chelsea. So you've got a number of these oligarchs' assets that have been frozen in Europe, in Canada, and US.
And all of that is kind of in the mix in these discussions that are going on at the moment.
Yes, there are different implications in terms of different types of money, but the focus really is on the state funds, so the central bank assets that are located mostly in Belgium, Germany, and France. Very little in the US and Canada. And so the discussion has mostly revolved around European Union and what they're willing to do.
Mm. And so the idea here is that these assets, which are currently frozen, as you say, would be seized permanently. What would that money be used for?
So there are different equations in the mix, if you'd like, or different purposes for which they could be used. The first one and the main one at the moment that's being discussed is, how do we help Ukraine fight the war? So it would be to support the war effort. The war is costing about $5 billion a month. And that's a big cost. And so the question is, how do you help Ukraine fight that war? So that's sort of the first heading. The second heading is, what happens after the war is over? How do you help a country that's been destroyed and that has been affected as much as Ukraine? How do you help it reconstruct itself? And how do you pay secure reparations for the people who are located there? And then there's the third thing, and this is like a new discussion that has developed in the last few months, is actually Russia within the Council of Europe has been one of the major violators of the European Convention on Human Rights, also in the context of the Ukrainian war. And one question that has arisen is, how do you make Russia pay the debts it has to pay under the judgments coming from the European Court of Human Rights? And so those are the three headings that are in some sense competing between each other in terms of priorities, but also in terms of the legal cases that we have for each one of them, or moral cases in terms of which one should take priority, or whether confiscation should take place at all.
Okay, so I mentioned two things in the intro there, but actually there's three possible uses for this money. So it could be to finance Ukraine's war effort, could be to finance reconstruction, or it could be to finance the or to pay for Russia's human rights violations.
Yes, and the argument on the human rights violations is that because we have a judgment from a court, and this is an international court to which Russia has agreed to be bound by its judgments, and it has agreed to comply with its judgments, the argument there is that because we have this piece of paper in our hands, that there's maybe a stronger case to have those types of compensations paid first, or that there's a legal argument that those should be paid before other claims are made.
And we've been talking there about how there are these discussions going on. And who's having these discussions? Is it just kind of academics pondering what ought to happen, or are there serious discussions among policymakers that could actually lead to policy change?
So I'd say there's a lot of discussion both on international and on domestic level, right? So on domestic level, there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, in the US and in Canada, where they've actually adopted legislation allowing for confiscation of such assets. Actually, Ukraine, in its own domestic legal order, has seized all Russian assets that it has on its territory and has made those assets available to people whose businesses have been destroyed. But when you take this to the international level, the discussion within the EU is primarily how do we help Ukraine fight the war? So how do we give it the $5 billion a month? And then the different countries come in. So UK has been a big supporter of the confiscation of assets. But now, because there's a concern about the legality of such a move, there's been more of a sort of a pullback and a rethinking. Could we perhaps not seize the assets, but use the assets as a loan guarantee? So European countries would come together, including the UK. They would take a loan guarantee. They would take a loan that would help Ukraine fight the war, but they would use the frozen assets that they have as a guarantee for that loan. So that would be a sort of plan B.
And you're talking there about the legality of these issues. So that takes us on into the content of the debate that is happening. And so I guess the main debate at the moment is about legality, and that's what we'll focus on for most of the time here. But there are also kind of moral dimensions and debates about, is this actually practically a good idea? Would it have desirable effects, which perhaps we should just touch on very, very briefly at the start of this. I mean, I guess the moral case for saying that these assets should be seized is a fairly straightforward one that says that, well, look at the terrible action that Russia has taken in Ukraine and how damaging that action has been. As a result of doing this thing, it kind of forfeits its rights in many ways, one might think, morally speaking. I mean, legally is another question, but morally one might think that. And one might also think that Russia ought to pay for what has happened, and therefore kind of feels reasonable that if there is this $300 billion block of money, that it would be legitimate, morally speaking, for that to be taken from Russia. Is that a fair kind of summary of the moral case?
I guess because we have the three different headings and purposes for which the money would be used, the moral case changes as you go from one to the other. So in terms of helping Ukraine fight the war, the moral case is if we don't, it will lose and we'll have an issue coming out of that. So that would be one. In terms of reparations, it's exactly what you said, right? So we've got here a massive destruction, not only of property, of a country, of its cultural heritage, of people's lives, businesses. And we have precedent, right, coming out of the Second World War where there were reparations paid by Germany for reconstruction of Europe, right? And so the argument is we need to apply sort of the same standards and allow Ukraine to repair the damage that has occurred on its territory.
And then the practical sort of consequential debate that is happening, at least one strand of that, is really interesting, actually. So, you'd think it's obvious that if we take the $300 billion of Russian assets, that would mean that there's a lesser financial burden on Western countries that are currently financing a lot of this effort and presumably would in the future finance a lot of the reconstruction. But there are some interesting arguments from economists, which I think we won't attempt to get into here, that say that, well, actually, if Western nations seize these assets, then that will make it less likely that other countries around the world will invest in Western nations, and that will potentially increase the interest rate that has to be paid by Western nations in order to borrow, and therefore in the long run, potentially there's a cost there. And also, I mean, at the moment it is the case that we have as reserve currencies, as currencies in which countries hold their assets. We have basically the dollar and the euro, and to a lesser extent the pound and the yen.
Yeah.
And if countries were worried that their assets would be seized in certain circumstances if they were held in these currencies, then they might be less likely to want to use these currencies, and therefore the whole international reserve currency system might change in ways that Western countries would find very disadvantageous.
Yeah.
So there are all of these practical going on.
Yes.
But we won't get into that. Let's focus then on the legal debate, which is where your real expertise and involvement in these debates comes in. I guess from my mind, it would be helpful at the start. I really ought to know this, but where are we in terms of kind of conclusive judgments on the legality of Russia's actions in Ukraine?
So I think there is consensus around the world that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is illegal, right? So we don't have a Security Council resolution from the United Nations because we've got the Russian veto, obviously, but going a bit broader and looking a bit broader, we do have a General Assembly resolution that is very clear in condemning the invasion of Ukraine. And actually, there is a separate General Assembly resolution which supported the creation, and this has happened in The Hague within the Council of Europe, the creation of a register of damages for Ukraine, where individuals can essentially report the damage that has occurred as a result of this invasion in anticipation of compensation that they will receive at a certain point in the future. But the General Assembly has been clear about the invasion being illegal and the fact that certain mechanism needs to be built to provide for redress in the future.
And as a decidedly lay person in these debates, I might think that if there's agreement that Russia's actions are illegal, then that would have implications for whether Russia's assets can be seized, and perhaps they can be in these circumstances, legally speaking. What are the issues there?
There is consensus that the assets can be frozen. We have a number of precedents where this has happened, and in relation to a number of other sort of examples of invasions or wars. But when it comes to confiscation, that would set a bigger precedent because states have thus far avoided confiscating another state's assets. And here we're really going beyond sort of thinking about, the diplomatic house of an ambassador or the military assets that they have. We're really thinking about the assets of a central bank that are held abroad. And so states have generally avoided touching that property because it's considered state property, and because of sovereign equality of states, they leave each other's property aside and they don't touch it. So it's untouchable. And also if you were to go to a court and make a claim against that property, the court would say, no, that property is immune and we can't enforce anything over it. But there is this approach or a rule in international law that if there has been an illegal act by one state, another state, the injured state, can respond to that illegal act by its own unlawful act, if you would like, but under certain circumstances. And then its response is not unlawful. And one of the conditions for this illegal act to not be illegal is that A, the act needs to be reversible, and B, it needs to aim to induce the other country to, for example, cease its illegal behavior.
So presumably it's on this basis that the assets have been frozen in the time being.
Exactly, because the freezing of assets can be reversed. And the freezing of assets, at least in theory, is intended to obviously prevent Russia from benefiting from the war and moving the money, but also is intended to bring Russia to the table, to come to a peace agreement, to cease the invasion. And the question is, can you push the law at the moment a step further and take the assets? And that's where we are. This is what the debate is. Would it be legal under international law to confiscate assets or not? And then it depends really, the answers to that depends on what is it you're using the assets for. So, for example, if you're using the assets to pay the money to Ukraine, what's the inducement there? So that's a bit tricky.
So the inducement for Russia to stop its illegal action?
Yes, right? But then we don't fulfill the reversibility criteria. So is confiscation reversible or not? Mm-hmm. And then the second one is, if you're taking the money or confiscating the money to provide for reparations, would that fulfill the reversibility criteria? Again, question mark. Inducement, perhaps. Perhaps that would bring it to the table. Definitely what doesn't fulfill the criteria is if you were going to take the money and pay Russia's human rights debts with that money. There's no inducement there. You've covered the debt it had. You're not changing its behavior in any way. So it is those tricky elements, really, that are making confiscation, in some sense, really problematic.
So if we look at the reparation case, again, I have a completely ignorant mind when it comes to these things, so you'll tell me if this is daft. But I guess my intuition is to think we know, well, maybe we don't know. So I don't know actually how reparations claims would be decided, but how it would be decided how much Russia is liable for there. But I mean, I'm thinking, I guess, if it's the case that it's $500 billion at least that reconstruction would cost, and if Russia is liable for that, if the amount we've got here is only 300 billion, then basically Russia's never going to get that money back anyway, because it's going to be liable for a higher sum of money. And therefore, in a sense, you're giving that money back when you're taking it off the amount of money that you're asking Russia to pay later on. Is that?
So that's a proportionality argument, right? So you're never going to get to the amount of money it owes, so just take the little amount. But it's still, for a lawyer, the key bit is, can you take? What have you done to a state property and to the state sovereignty and sovereign equality principle by taking a state's property away from it? And one of the questions is, could these rules on countermeasures, so this is called a countermeasure, right? So if a state has done something illegal, you can take a countermeasure and respond back to it. And that's what confiscation would be. And the main question at the moment in international law is, is this a special circumstance? And do states want to depart from their practice of using these countermeasures for inducement or requiring their reversibility? And do they want to change their practice and thus set new rules of international law, or new practices, if you'd like?
So you're saying that we can't justify the seizing of these assets, even for reparations purposes, under the existing rules or the existing conventions, the existing precedents, because we can't justify the reversibility claim.
Exactly.
And therefore it would be about creating new precedents in international law, essentially.
Yeah. The conservative approach at the moment that is being suggested is that essentially what we need to do is keep the assets frozen for any one of those three priorities that we started with, keep them frozen until we bring Russia to the debating table and until it agrees in a peace agreement that it will pay reparations. And at that point, we get the money. That obviously does not resolve the problem for Ukraine, who needs the money right now, and it wants to have it secured for the end of the story. It also doesn't help people who really believe that if you were to confiscate assets now, you would actually exercise so much pressure on Russia that it would come to the debating table.
This is fascinating. It's exposing how ignorant I am of how international law was created. But hopefully I'm not the only one listening to this podcast who is also intrigued and surprised by all of this. I mean, it kind of sounds like you can sort of make up the rules as you go along, in a sense.
It might sound like that, so some of this is written down, but it's not written down in a treaty. It is written down in what we call the draft articles on state responsibility that codify existing practice. Now, this existing practice was codified in 2000. We're today in 2024. And the big question for us international lawyers is, what has the practice done in between? And it is the practice of states and the belief of states, what they're going to do in this situation, that can change practice and therefore the law for the future. And this is why this case is so interesting, because it has brought, and I should really say, it has brought together European states. So the rest of the world isn't, and I guess the US and Canada, so the Western states, the rest of the world isn't so interested in this problem. And so how this problem gets resolved is really probably in Europe, where the money is, and it probably gets resolved in the European institutions rather than at the UN.
So we should talk a bit about the conversations that are taking place at the moment and the conversations that you're very much involved in. And as I understand it, these are taking place not in the European Union, which is the institution that we all know with 27 member states, the one that the UK left, but rather in the Council of Europe, which is a much broader and actually older organisation with 46 member states, so pretty much all European countries apart from Russia and Belarus. Less well-known institution, but the institution that kind of owns the European Convention and European Court of Human Rights, if you like. Why is the conversation taking place in the Council of Europe? I guess that's the first question.
Yeah.
And then what sort of conversation is happening?
When the invasion took place, you had both the General Assembly of the United Nations really condemning the invasion as an illegal act, but at the same time, you also had the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly, taking a very clear stance that this kind of behavior within the group of 47 countries that they were at the time would not be tolerated, that this was an attack by one member state of the club, of the Council of Europe against another one. And so Russia at that point is expelled, and this is the first time in history it happens that the Council decides to actually kick a member of its own out of the club, if you'd like. And from that point onward, the question is really, will then any solutions that we're thinking about in terms of confiscating measures, but also in terms of bringing Russia to the table, will that happen within the UN or will it happen in the Council of Europe? And I think, as I mentioned before, there's really not enough appetite within the UN to meddle in this, what they call European problem. So they're very much seeing Ukraine as a European war, and so Europe should fix it. And even when they came to the decision that they would support the establishment of a mechanism of the register for damages, the support there was very divided in the General Assembly. And so anything that happens above that, above the creation of this register, which was created within the Council of Europe, will happen because the Council of Europe thinks this is a good idea. And this is really where the discussions are now taking place. The Council of Europe at the moment is discussing whether it could create an international claims commission or a sort of an international fund where member states, including Belgium, which is key here because it's got to 200 billion euros, where member states could send the funds to, so transfer the funds, and they are distinguishing the term transfer from confiscation. So confiscation would be taking away, whilst transfer, there's an implied element of reversibility to it. You transfer it, but you can also always transfer it back. Now, legally, there's a question mark there if you really can do, but the terminology is around transfer. The idea is that European states would transfer the money to this international commission within the Council of Europe, which would then, on the basis of decisions of the European Court or the Register for Damages, dispense and disburse this money.
Do you have a sense of what the outcome of this process might be?
I think this it's likely to take... So, there's division, obviously, within the Council of Europe about whether or not this is a good idea. Council of Europe is not only 27 states like European Union. It's a much broader institution that includes a number of countries that border Russia and that are Russia friendly, if you'd like. So there's a question to what extent this would actually politically go through.
And what level of consensus is required in order for it to go through?
It depends on which level it gets decided. The Parliamentary Assembly has already decided that there should be an international mechanism. So that has already gone through Parliament. But as it gets to the executive branch, the Committee of Ministers, those kind of discussions happen behind those closed doors, and so you actually never know what the numbers say. So it would happen at that level. And I think, and that's really where, what the Council is currently doing is setting up a working group that will think through these different approaches and different priorities of what the money should go for, and think about the legal basis for each one of them. And then it will go to this executive branch, the Committee of Ministers, to think about which one of those should be taken.
Mm-hmm. And do we know what key governments think? So you mentioned the UK government, for example, has been very much pro-confiscation.
Yeah.
It sounds like the Belgian government's view of this is going to be particularly important. But I guess also, you know, generally we think Germany, France, they matter a lot in these discussions as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a number of Western countries that are very keen on doing something. There's a number of countries from the east that border Russia that are very keen on also supporting this transfer. But I think it's really, can you fit everyone together? And it is which element of the equation are they all going to support? So it's what is the minimum they all agree around. But what was interesting, so I presented sort of the legal issues around this debate at the Committee of Legal Ministers in Strasbourg a few weeks ago. And it was interesting to see that in the room, there was a lot of support for doing something. So the feeling is that the momentum is here, but it's also coming from the institution itself. So the Council of Europe for a long time has been a sort of a institution we didn't know much about, or we didn't think it relevant. We knew about the court, but not the council really. And now they really feel, they want to set up a tribunal for a crime of aggression in Ukraine. And they want to do this claim commission, which would have, kind of control over the assets.
Do you have a sense of the timescale on which this conversation will take place? I mentioned at the start the presidential election in the United States in November. Of course, if Trump were to win, then he would enter office in January, and potentially there could be significant changes in US policy taking place fairly quickly after that. What sort of timescale is the Council of Europe working on?
So so the working group will start working in September, and it will I expect work maybe a few terms, maybe 6 months to a year, and then this will go to the Committee of Ministers. The issue was very sensitive. It sort of feels very sensitive, both because of the EU elections and because of the US election. And so the question is, what can be done beforehand? So at the moment, actually, at the EU level, there's been debate about taking the interest on the Euroclear money, so the 5 billion that is generated a year, taking that and giving it to Ukraine. That is going, but really the discussion is going to be about the thing that is untouchable, and that's the 200 billion. And the feeling is that there is enough time, that this is not going to be resolved within a year or so.
One final question. Alas, we're running out of time, as we always do. You mentioned that countries outside Europe and North America have not wanted to get involved, and kind of suggesting that, well, this isn't an issue for us. But it sounds like the decision that is made on this potentially has enormous knock-on effects for international law.
Yeah.
And therefore for the globe as a whole in how we deal with these kinds of situations.
Yeah, so I think this is a really fascinating case because it has implications both for international law and for human rights laws. For human rights law, for example, if the Council of Europe decides that this new mechanism should also be used to pay money for Russian debts, we have effectively set up a precedent where you can take a country's assets to pay compensation for human rights violations. It means that, again, in a situation like Cyprus v. Turkey, where we have a big case of 10, 20, 30 million to be paid, does this mean that in the next case, we could take Turkish assets and pay compensation to individuals? That's one aspect. It could really redesign the human rights system and how we think about enforcement and execution of judgments. On the international level, what countries do and whether they make the step from freezing to transfer or confiscation is going to set a precedent for what we think is legal or illegal, or what a countermeasure should look like in the future. Now, that new practice could be limited to Europe only or to the West only, and it could apply differently for Latin America and Asia, but it is an important precedent. And so I think at the moment countries are very careful about what they do, what they say, and how they do it.
Well, what an interesting discussion. I've learned a huge amount, and a different kind of discussion from the one we normally have on the podcast, where we're focusing on a particular piece of research that's just been published. But we have a researcher who's out there in the field engaging with these policy-making processes. So thank you so much, Veronica. Really
Thank you for having me.
Great to hear you on these subjects. And we'll need to have you back in the coming months on the podcast in order to hear more about how this is going. Next week, we will be looking at public perceptions of the economy, and in particular, we'll be asking, why do voters often appear to support austerity? Remember to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Alice Hart and Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.